Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here with us this morning. My name is Mariana Spence, and I'm with Carolina Farm Stewardship Association at the 36th Sustainable Agriculture Conference. You have joined African American Century Farms and Landownership, presented by Erica Cormack. She's the executive director at Anathoth Community Garden in Cedar Grove, and she's also part of her family's fifth generation farm. So we're really excited to have her here with us today. And I just wanted to point out that we have a chat where you can introduce yourselves and ask questions throughout the presentation. And we will take some pauses to answer those and also catch back up and answer them at the end. So, hey, Erica, we're so happy to have you. And I will take myself out and we'll get started with the presentation.
Hey, y'all. Thank you so much for joining me, and thank you so much for asking me to be a part of this. And so I'm going to talk about African American Century Farms and land ownership. But before I even introduce myself or go into any of this, here's a picture of someone who obviously has nothing to do with Black century farms or land ownership, but I feel a little bit like this person today. Because I'm just speaking to y'all. I'm not really able to get a lot of feedback. My background is in experiential education, and so I'm used to giving a lot of workshops with a lot of interaction. And I'd just like to thank you ahead of time for bearing with me through this. This is the first time that I've ever spoken on a platform like this before, and COVID is just really strange. And when I originally agreed to this workshop, I thought it was going to be in person, but of course, circumstances have deemed otherwise. And I'm sorry for any challenges that might arise through this, and hopefully everything will go well. But I do feel a lot like this person, just sort of speaking into the dark. I'm sure that y'all probably received this morning, like I did, that was giving an overview of the workshop. And I just wanted to be clear and transparent about the fact that when I first signed up to do this, I had originally anticipated it was going to be in person. So I've had to sort of cater this to speaking digitally. And I'm just going to go over what I'm going to cover in this workshop. As I said, I'd hoped that it would be more interactive, but it's going to be a little bit more like a lecture. And I will pause and give some opportunity to answer some questions to the best of my ability, of course. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction about myself and about Anathoth, a little bit about my family. Then I'm going to sort of deep dive into the weeds of the history of African American land ownership in America. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about my family story. I'm going to talk a little bit about what it might have looked like to buy land in 1921 if you were Black. I'm going to talk a tiny bit about culture erasure. And I'm going to talk about a Black land ownership survey and some of the findings that I found that I conducted recently. So my goal of this workshop would be for folks to learn a little bit about a subgroup of people that you may not be aware of. And so that is my primary goal for this. So if we were in person, I would do an icebreaker with y'all, and I would go around the room, and this is my favorite icebreaker. And what I usually ask is, where is your mother's mother from? So your maternal grandmother, where is she from? Who is she? And the reason why I do that is because I think it's really, really important work to sort of ground ourselves in the moment and give thanks and just honor the people who came before us and brought us here. And I'm aware that that's not particularly a trauma-informed question. So if that kind of if that brings up something for you, then feel free to not participate. Feel free to not pause and think about that. But I just think that's really, really important work, because this workshop for me is not just about Black land ownership. This is about my ancestors. This is sacred to me. And I just think it's really important to give thanks and to just acknowledge people who came before us. So if you just want to pause for a moment and just think about that and think about the people who brought you here. Also acknowledging that we do live on stolen land. Who came before you? Like who were they? So for the purpose of this workshop, when I say African American, I'm talking about ethnicity. And so ethnicity, the definition, it's about like a common national or cultural transition. And I just want to acknowledge that for the purposes of this workshop, American racial identity is really rigid. It's really rooted in white supremacy. And so most Americans, specifically African Americans, come from mixed backgrounds, whether that's a mixture of different tribes that were coming or a mixture of different races that were here. And we only exist here. And so when I ask the question, where's your mother's mother from? Or who are your people? This is super important work for African Americans in particular, because we only exist here. We haven't existed anywhere else. There are lots of commonalities between people who are in the African diaspora, but for African Americans, we only exist here. And so it's just super important for us to validate our experiences that and to acknowledge that. So, as I said before, my name is Erica Cormack. I am the executive director of Anathoth Community Garden. We are a nonprofit located in Cedar Grove, North Carolina, and we got started as the result of a murder that happened in our community. And one of the unique things about this murder is the man who was murdered was a white man who happened to be married to a Black woman. And there was something that felt kind of racial about this murder, and it felt like it was sort of bringing up a lot of racial tensions. So the person who donated the land that we now operate our garden on, and it is Black-owned land, she donated it with the hope that we would bring different people together. And so that is what our focus is on. It focuses on bringing people together, all kinds of people together, particularly over differences, and just finding commonality in those things, and finding commonality around gardening and around our rural farm culture. So you can see here in this image a picture of a woman with a cow and her chickens, and this is actually my great grandmother. This is my grandfather's, my father's father's mother. So this is not my maternal grandmother. This is my father's mother. And she was a woman called Jenny, and she is there shown on her farm, which is located in Wilkesboro, North Carolina. And that land is actually still in our family. My dad and his brother still own it. And I just thought that this was a really cool picture of an ancestor who's farming. I found it on ancestry.com, actually. And yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about me and my background, why I'm presenting this workshop. I'm a 5th generation landowner. I currently reside in Cedar Grove, North Carolina. And I'm just super excited to talk about this. And it's those things that people are often asking me, like, really? Like, you're a 5th generation landowner? And I'm excited to get the opportunity to talk a little bit more about that and how that happened. So before I deep dive, I just wanted to share this quote from this really beautiful book called We Are Each Other's Harvest that I read earlier this year. And it goes, "This is a remembering on the land we wrote in a seed-coded language, centered in the archive knowledge planted in the soil of each and every African who managed to arrive alive on these shores. We passed from one generational era to the next, an incredible lore. We were forced not only into raising a nation from its infancy, but walking the Atlantic world into eternity, leaving behind what blood we hoped we would not miss. This borrowed place, now partly made of your ancestors, is your old country. Some of us are sharecroppers, others tenants, but many of us were landowners." So I want you to think about when you think the oldest account of Black land ownership on U.S. soil was. So I'm just going to have a pause, think about that. And just to give you a little bit of context, most of us know that the first Africans were brought here that are documented. The first Africans that we have documented were brought here in 1619. So when do you think the count of Black land ownership on U.S. soil was? So here's a bit of a timeline to give some context. As I said, 1619, the first Blacks were brought to Virginia. Anthony Johnson was the first account that we have of ownership in America, and that was in 1651. And at one point, he owned 250 acres. So 1651, that's pretty early on. And if you can see the document with the funny right corner, that actually is a document from the Crown at the time, from the Empire of England, that says that because Anthony Johnson was a Negro, his land, he was an alien, and so his land had to be consumed by the Crown. It was not able to pass on to his descendants. So even though we have this great story of this Black guy who owned land, this kind of sets the tone for this, unfortunately, because even though people might have been able to acquire land, that doesn't mean that they were going to be able to keep it. So just a little bit of background information. In the 1600s, we do know that a lot of the folks who were being brought over as indentured servants. So indentured servants were folks who served a certain amount of servitude, and then they were able to be freed or released at some point. And so we have Black people who met this criteria, and we also have white people who met this criteria. And this is where we start to get the concept of free people of color. So this is a term that's used to describe a non-enslaved person during slavery in America who has African ancestry. And free people of color were identified as either Black or mulatto. Mulatto is a term that we don't use anymore. It's very antiquated. It basically just means mixed, someone who has Black and white ancestry. Sometimes it's used to describe someone who has Black and Native American ancestry. But now we just put it all in category of Black. So anyways, as I said, 1600s, we see a lot of indentured servants, and then the 1700s, that's completely replaced with enslaved people and the slave trade. And that continues, and so you're not seeing as many free people of color or people who are gaining freedom until 1776, which is when the Revolutionary War happened. And that is when a lot of slaves were able to fight and gain freedom. And so you see another kind of burst of free people of color in the censuses at the time. And they were also able to acquire their freedom during the War of 1812. So in 1804, the northern states abolished slavery. And in the 1800s, on a census, like as you go down every census year, you start to see more free people of color. And as a result, there's more of the likelihood that they would be landowners. And so the 1850 to 1860 census indicates that about 8% of the population of the whole of the United States were free people of color. And 2 people in slaveholding states were free people of color. Now, I also just want to say that this does not diminish that this is an exception. The rule was slaves, and this is a very, very privileged population of people. And, you know, as I talk about this, I do have ancestors that were people of color, but I also had enslaved ancestors. Obviously, most people of color came here as enslaved people, and that should not at all diminish the very real truth that this is a very horrible thing that happened in the history of America. Even though there were people who were able to get freedom, that was a privilege. It was pretty terrible, and that shouldn't be taken lightly. So if you look at the bottom, you can see a table that shows the amount of free folks, free people of color that existed from 1790 on to 1860. Of course, 1863 is when the emancipation happened. That is when slavery ended in North Carolina. We do know that it didn't officially end until 1865 when the slaves were released in Texas. But around the time of emancipation, a lot of slaves ended up becoming sharecroppers. And so at the time, 1/3 of all sharecroppers in the United States were Black. So the Southern Homestead Act was passed in 1866. And after that, Blacks were granted citizenship, and it gave Blacks the opportunity to buy land in Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Before that, there was another law that was passed that basically was hoping to give a lot of land that was owned by Confederate soldiers and people to Blacks who had been former slaves. That was quickly vetoed by Andrew Johnson, who became president after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, because he was a Confederate man. The Confederacy, he was Southern, and he didn't like that. So he replaced that act with the Southern Homestead Act. And so it gave both Blacks and whites the opportunity to acquire land. And just in these places. And obviously I know that's not as relevant to North Carolina, but it's just context. And so most of the pieces of land that they were able to purchase were 80-acre parcels of land. And so you get 6,500 claims of Black folks to homesteads. And only 1,000 of those resulted in land ownership, unfortunately. So at the peak of land ownership, or Black land ownership in America, over 14 million acres of land were owned by approximately 210,000 Black people. That's pretty incredible. So in that time at the peak, 14% of all farmland in the United States, and I know this is a statistic that a lot of people throw out these days, but 14% of all farmland in the United States was owned. And that's amazing, because you're talking about 11% of the population at the time. And it starts to go downhill after that. So, again, this is a question that I do get asked a lot. People want to know, like, you're an African-American 5th-generation landowner that exists? Yes, it does. It really. I currently live on a piece of property. Some of it was passed down from my second great grandfather, who is a man called Richard. And you can see a document that's there in the corner that was actually given to me or found by someone at Cedar Grove Law. So thank you for that. And it basically is where my second great-grandfather purchased land in 1898. You can see 16th day of April 1898. You can see in the corner that he has purchased this land for $316. So yeah, like this is the story of my land. And so the oldest I have on my mother's side, which I'm gonna speak about, although I'll touch a little bit about my father's side, because all of them are still currently have land in the family. But 1865 is the oldest account that I have, and that is land in Pleasant Grove, North Carolina, where a person of color purchased land. And so that's pretty significant. That piece of land is still owned by family members, distant family members, but still owned by family members. And that piece of land actually is where the church that I grew up in was situated. So just a really unique story. So the picture that is there with the people who are curing tobacco is actually a picture of a very famous person called Doc Corbett. So Doc Corbett at one point was one of the wealthiest African-American men in North Carolina. He owned more land than any person in Orange County at the time. And he was my second great uncle. And so he was my great grandmother's brother. And he was actually a descendant of this guy, Richard Corbett, where you can see that he's purchased land in 1898. And so, yeah, I just find that very remarkable. So currently, in order to be a century landowner or to have a century farm, you would have had to have bought land in 1921. And so according to the USDA, land averages in 1920 were $69 an acre. And so today, the buying power of that is roughly $946. So basically $1,000. So what are the things that people would have had to face, Black folks would have had to face if they were buying land during that time? Well, Jim Crow laws obviously is a big thing. Black folks who were buying land in 1921 and before had to be smart. They had to use resources. All of my family members purchased their land and they were able to create businesses. And those businesses thrived because they utilized their community. They sold to other Black folks. And my great grandmother, the person who passed down the land that I currently reside on, she had a milk road and she delivered milk to people in the local area. She was also a midwife. And this was one of the ways that she was able to buy and maintain land. On my dad's side of the family, my great grandfather he owned a store in Yadkinville, North Carolina, and he sold exclusively to Black folks. He also had a dry cleaning business. And Black folks were able to build and maintain wealth. But you also had to know during that time that because of Jim Crow laws, because of the corruption, and because of the fact that the judicial system favored white folks, your everything could be taken from you just because a white person wanted it. Another story that is from my family is I want to say a second great grandfather. Yes, a second great grandfather who was described as phenotypically white. And so that means that he looked like a white person. My grandfather told me that he had hair and blue eyes, and he was married to someone who was phenotypically Black. And he had a man come by one day on a horse and asked to see his land deed. And the person who came to ask to see his land deed, he gave it to them. He just trusted this man, this white man. And he gave him the deed, and this white man just rode off with it and never came back with it. So you just had to know that anything that you had could be taken away from you. And it's a very good chance that you wouldn't get it back just because the judicial system favored white people over Black people. Another example of this is Tulsa, which actually happened in 1921, the Tulsa Massacre, where you have this thriving Black community that gets destroyed by a mob of white people. So yeah, you just had to be smarter, but you also and there was an element of luck that was involved in it. You had to know that everything that you had could have been taken away. Just another quick story from my own family about having to be smarter, racial issues is my aunt. She talks about my great grandmother, the one who had the milk route, and she talks about how when my great grandfather passed away, her husband, they had ordered a tombstone from a white vendor, and this vendor came and dropped a tombstone and said, I'm going to need payment for this now. And my great grandmother said, no, I've already paid for it. And he said, well, I don't have any proof that you for it. She said, hold on, I'm going to get you a receipt. She went into her house and she got the receipt. And the guy was like, okay, I'm going to take it. And she's like, no, that's my copy. And I love that story of just someone who was sassy. And you had to be careful because, if that guy had taken it the wrong way, then she could have easily gotten hung. But that's just the way that family were. They talked a lot about not buying things on time, which was a credit system where you paid things off over time. They talked about just paying for things when you could afford them and as you afford them. So why is all important? Why is this relevant? This is all relevant because Black land loss is erasure of culture. It literally is erasure of culture. When we talk about erasure of culture, usually that's associated, even though it is something that sort of often happens over time and slowly, it's something that's associated with genocide. It's something that's associated with violence. And for people, Black people who are descendants of Africans, people who are members of the African diaspora, there is very little that we have been able to retain of our culture from Africa. But farming is something that we brought here. Farming was something that we were allowed to keep and to retain. And so when we talk about Black land loss, when we talk about Black folks losing land, when we talk about Black folks not farming, when we talk about the concept of someone thinking that it's very rare for a Black person to be a farmer, we are talking about erasure of culture. So, okay, before I go into the next part, this is a good place to pause and to answer any questions. I don't know if you want to come back on and facilitate some questions.
Hey, okay, we've had a few come in. One was an explanation of Black codes, and it looks like there's a little bit of an answer in the chat, but we'd love to hear from you about that too.
Yeah, so Black codes, from what I understand, they were just different types of laws and I am sorry, I'm not an expert on certain things that are laws. I'm not an expert on all of it, but it's my understanding that each state had different laws that were there to ensure that Black people were, or just to reiterate Jim Crow laws. I know that one of those laws in particular that has nothing to do with land, but this was in South Carolina, is the 8th rule, which is if you are more than 8th Black, you were considered Black. That's a Black code. So there's lots of different laws in there that literally just reiterated Jim Crow laws.
Gotcha. And then another one, this was actually my question that kind of goes in with that, is I was wondering if there were stipulations around what Black landowners could do with their land. So to try to take away some of that ability to do what they want. Did they have to farm? Could they not farm? Could they not start a certain type of business? Was there anything like that?
So with the Homestead Act, it wasn't specifically for Black folks, but as you saw, it was 6,500, I think that was the right number, 6,500 folks who applied to get these steads, and only 1,000 were able to acquire them. So there were stipulations, and that was for Black people and white people that sort of were for whether or not you could acquire that land and you could own it. I think that a lot of I'm so sorry, that I'm not giving a solid answer, but I think that for a lot of folks, Jim Crow situations, it could just be somebody just decided that you're a Black person, so you're not going to get to keep this land, unfortunately. But there wasn't anything, to my knowledge, that I researched within my research that I could find that there were stipulations specifically for Black people.
Mm-hmm. And then another question, how are you taking care of yourself during this presentation when you're sharing this knowledge with a mostly white audience? And, I think our audience member is acknowledging the pain that you're probably bringing with us from some of your ancestry.
You know what? Something that's really great about this workshop is, as somebody who is a fifth generation landowner, or who comes from folks that were fifth generation landowners, it's often difficult for me to feel seen in society, because a lot of my ancestors come from subgroups and subcultures that aren't really talked about, and they aren't really the rule, they're the exception. So I'm really excited I get to share this knowledge. Yeah, I'm taking care of myself. I'm here for it.
Awesome. Well, we're glad to hear that. And I think we're ready to, I'll pop back out and we'll keep going. Thank you so much.
Okay. Good stuff. All right, so I'm not sure where, let's see if I can, okay. So I conducted a land ownership survey. I was trying to reach as many Black century owners as possible, and I was only able to contact 9 and or to get 9 folks to participate. But I can tell you, in Cedar Grove, North Carolina, where I currently reside, there are 4 different families that are currently eligible for century recognition. I think that one of them is registered with the state of North Carolina as a century farm. My family are currently in the process of doing that as a result of this workshop. So I'm sorry if that makes me seem like a little bit of a hypocrite, but that's just where it is. And so these are some of the questions that I asked. Just things, as long as the family in question been in your family, how many generations, where's your farm, do you know how your family acquired the land, are you able to describe the soil quality, which I thought was very important, because it was my understanding that a lot of the land that was acquired by Black folks was, especially in 1920 and above, was it was poor land. There was poor soil quality. So is the land still being farmed, currently now or in its heyday? What was the farm's primary crop, like so on, etc. So yeah, like I've got some really great responses. I'm not going to share all of them with you, but I'm going to share some of them with you. And for the purpose of this, like, all of the answers were anonymous. Also, I just want to be transparent and say that I'm also a doctoral student, and my doctoral research revolves around sense of agency, which is the concept of how we feel about our lives, how much control we feel like we have over our lives, and how that affects our life outcomes. And so particularly with this study, I've been really interested in the connection between property ownership and land ownership, land stewardship, and outcomes and sense of agency. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as this goes on, but these are some of the findings. So these are the 9 families that I interviewed, and some of the folks weren't able to give an exact date, but they knew for a fact that their family was in ownership before or by the time of a certain person's birth. So I've got over 100 years Cedar Grove, North Carolina, 156 years Pleasant Grove, North Carolina, 89 years Rockingham County, 101 years Caswell County, 123 years Cedar Grove, North Carolina, 97 years Cedar Grove, North Carolina, 100 years Cedar Grove, North Carolina, 103 years Mount Meigs, Montgomery, Alabama. So there's one person from Alabama. I just put out a blast on social media asking folks to participate, and I just thought it was really interesting. This person from Alabama wanted to participate because they had a century farm, and I know that this is mostly about North Carolina, but I was really interested in what they had to say too, and I'm glad that they participated. And over 100 years, Wilkesboro, North Carolina. So most of the folks in the survey who completed the survey, they are not currently farming their land, but 4 out of the 9 families that I interviewed still are. And most people said tobacco, no surprise there. But there were a few other crops. Some people included vegetables and livestock. And one farm in Cedar Grove actually had peanuts as a main cash crop. Most of the interviewees knew other long-term Black landowners, and most people described their soil as a red clay, aside from the person in Al who described their soil as prairie soil, which, from what I understand, please feel free to correct me, because I'm an expert. And something that I wasn't transparent about from the beginning is, even though I live on a century farm, and even though I'm the director of a community garden, I don't think that I would call myself a farmer. I'm learning to farm, but I'm, just to be transparent, I'm not a farmer. I'm not that at all. But prairie soil, from what I understand, is another type of Piedmont soil. It's similar to clay, but it might be just a little bit more spacious. Please feel free, if anyone knows the answer to that, to chime in and educate me. So this is just like a couple of quotes from, do you think that land ownership has given your family economic advantage? Every single person said yes. But I liked this quote. Yes, because of the revenue the farm produced. Dad and mom were able to pay off the farm in record time. It would have been impossible for a Black man to make the same income in a public job in the 60s. Moreover, the land was still in the family, and we still see it growing, whatever the land will permit. Also, there's abundance of new trees on the property, which can be sold for low now. And if left for many years to come, trees on the property can be sold in about 10 to 15 years, that will have doubled in value. And that's one thing about farming, it keeps on giving. And I love that quote by someone who owned or family owns a century farm in Cedar Grove. So yes, provided a sense of security. So as I said, every one of the Black farmers that I interviewed, or the Black landowners that I interviewed, did feel like it provided a sense of like a benefit, an economic advantage. This is the one that I found super important. And I know that this is very naughty of me as a researcher. This is a very contrived question. How old is the oldest surviving member connected to your family's land? But you can see here, all these people are above the age of 80, which is super interesting and just really noteworthy. So the life expectancy in the US, and some of these people, I just want to be transparent, are deceased. But the current life expectancy in the US as a whole is 78.9. For a Black female, that's 75.8. And for a Black male, that's 68.3. So you are getting, all the people on here are octogenarians. All the people on here are above the age of 80. And then you have 3 centenarians, so 3 people who are living 100 and above. And 2 of those are actually still alive today, which is just incredible. So this is just, just providing a little bit of information about my personal research as a doctoral student. Is land and property ownership connected? So a lot of folks might be thinking, of course it is. Of course, wealth is connected to health, and it's not necessarily. There's this great individual called Sir Michael Cormack. He is a very famous public health professional, and he's done a lot of studies, but particularly one on a community of Whitehall in London. And what was interesting about the community of Whitehall is it's a very, very, very diverse population. So you have different people from different racial backgrounds, different incomes, just lots and lots of variation. And was doing this study on people's health, and he found that people's health outcomes were not linked to their lifestyle choices. So whether or not they smoked, whether or not they, or what they ate, whether or not they ate, just lots of different things, or even income. He found that it was down to 2 things, which were autonomy, so control and empowerment. People who are often at risk of heart disease. absence, increased risk of absence from work, of decrements in physical and social functioning. And he says that there are good biological reasons why. And he also says that social participation was the thing that was most common in people who had positive life outcomes or health outcomes. He says, like, being able to take up your place in society, a fully paid up member, being able to benefit from all that society has to offer. So these things are linked to having a mindset of control over one's life. And there's this beautiful concept of place shaping that's very, very common in the it was coined by an individual called Michael Lyons, and it talks about how the local government should act as the whole community and as an agent of place. And it talks about how important it is that people, for somebody's happiness, that they feel like they have control over where they live. And land ownership is directly linked to place shape. Just another thing, like, I know I don't want to get too deep in the weeds because this is a workshop about Black land ownership, but it is related. And this is kind of the direction where my research is headed. But Ikigai, which is a book about the Japanese secret to a long and healthy life, is a book where the writers did a bunch of studies over several years of populations in blue zones, which are areas of the world that have a high concentration of octogenarians, so people living above the age of 80. And in these contexts, they talk about certain things that all of these people had in common. Okinawa, Japan, was an area, or actually a lot of Japan is a place where you have like a lot of blue zones, concentration of people who are living above the age of 80. And so they talk a lot about how these people have certain commonalities. And one of them is, it's not necessarily what they eat, it's how they eat. So people are not eating to the point of being full. They say 80% of your stomach intake. That's how much you should eat to, live. But the thing that is common in all these people, in all these blue zones, and another blue zone is, or there are some more blue zones in Italy, there's some more blue zones in South America. Something that's common is people feeling like they had an ikigai, which is this Japanese concept of having a purpose, And so another place that my research is headed is land ownership, is land stewardship associated with having a sense of purpose? So these are just some things that I'm working on as the study evolves, still going on. Feel free to participate, because I've only interviewed white folks. So if you would like to participate, here is a QR code that you can scan with a link. And yeah, so I think that is about it. I know it's not completely conclusive, but I think that the last thing I really just want to leave y'all with is this idea that Black land loss is erasure of culture. It really, really is. So I can take some questions if y'all have been able to scan the QR.
I think we have lots of requests for your final paper, so we're all fascinated and would love to see that whenever it's ready. But I don't see any other questions coming in yet. How is it okay for folks to follow up with you by email if they have questions, or can they connect in other ways?
Yeah, of course. You definitely can follow up with me via email. Will that email be shared? My email, will that be shared?
If that's okay, we can put it.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
I am just going to warn you, I am in the beginning of my doctoral study, so I've got a ways to go before my dissemination is, completely done. But I am excited to see where this research goes.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. Okay, let's see. Has heirs property issues been a challenge for any of your family?
So my direct line. It has not. My grandfather was very, very clever. And before he passed away, so he had 4 girls. One of them was my mom. And before he passed away, he sectioned off his land. And this is before he even got sick. He died of cancer. He sectioned off his land and he gave it to his daughters. Like, so that was something that was very, very, he was before his time. And that was very effective. And I do have cousins and aunts and uncles that did not do that, and it's caused problems. But for my direct line, that has not been an issue. That's another thing that's very interesting that I failed to mention, is Richard, the man who I showed you the deed where he purchased land in 1898. In his will, so he passed away in 1914. And in his will, you can see where he has divided land equally. And he said, I want to divide my land equally amongst my children. And he lists every single one of the children. And the thing that's so particularly interesting and amazing about that is he lists the girls too. And at that time, people weren't really leaving land to females. So it's really, really cool. And I'm very grateful that that is my history and that's my story.
Yeah, that is amazing. That's like goosebumps amazing. We have another question about the farms you interviewed, related, how many do you know if they were owned by individuals versus family members?
So one of them, for a fact, I know it's just an individual currently because that was one of the centenarians who's still on their property. Let me think. Yes. So one of the property in Pleasant Grove is owned by multiple family members. And the property in Alabama is owned by multiple family members. I think that most of them are owned by multiple family members. I think there's only a few that are individuals.
Gotcha. I don't see any more questions coming up. We've got a few links to more resources in the chat. Noah has shared Black farmers and farm ownership research, data and info through NC Farm Link, which some of y'all might find helpful. But are there any more questions or comments for Erica? Well, we just appreciate you doing this presentation so much, and it was amazing. So thank you, and I will probably rewatch this, and we're really grateful to have you at the conference.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.